Hi, Joy. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm sorry. I can't hear you, so I just needed to make sure. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I am so excited and honored to be joining from StoryCorps to share a story with you this morning um, and as we'll be doing throughout the week. As you may know, StoryCorps is committed to the idea that everyone has an important story to tell and everyone's story matters. And our mission is to help us believe in each other by illuminating the humanity and possibility in us all, one story at a time. And so, since our founding in 2003, we've helped nearly 700,000 people across the country have meaningful conversations about their lives. We collect these recordings at the Library of Congress, and this is now the single largest collection of human voices gathered in one place. So, this story, to get to the story, Reverend James Seawood grew up in the 1950s in Sheridan, Arkansas, and attended an all Black school there. The town's main employer and landlord was a lumber mill. So, following the mandate to integrate public schools, the mill began to force its African American employees and tenants out of town in order to keep their schools all white. So, as the population diminished and there were fewer and fewer students and teachers at the school, James' mother became his school's principal, janitor, and essentially everything else that was needed. He came to StoryCorps to remember and reflect on the fate of his school and the human cost of urban renewal. Let's watch.
As a child, I would climb up on the lumber stack and look over at the white school. Huge school with a band, football team, everything that you could imagine. And on our side, here we were with our two-room school, outdoor toilets, and two teachers. And gradually, as the Black population in town began to go down, that left my mother there at the school as the principal, the janitor, whatever was needed, she had to do everything. And as long as there was one Black child left in town, they had to keep the school open. So 10, 9, 8, mother was there till the last child, the last family was forced out of town. So I remember one day, mother and I got in the old station wagon because mother had heard that the school was going to be torn down. We went inside the school, we got whatever records we could find, we put them in the back of the station wagon. Then a big bulldozer came and dug a deep hole. And after digging this deep hole, just pushed our beloved school in the hole and covered it up. And it was as though it was never there. Years later, when I was in graduate school and people would talk about urban renewal, I had a particular perspective. To me, urban renewal meant they'll dig a deep hole and push your school, cover it up, and it'll be like the school never existed or you never existed. I'll never forget those days. Even today, this town of Sheridan, Arkansas, is an all-white town. And if you ever have an opportunity to go through that town, drive very slowly.
We are celebrating the anniversary of Brown v. Board, and so those are separate from civil liberties, right? So I work for the American Civil Liberties Union. We are a civil rights and civil liberties organization. These two things go together but are different. Civil liberties are your rights to be protected from the government in expressing your identity, in expressing yourself and being who you are, while civil rights are the right to be protected by the government from others for who you are and your identity. And these two things together, civil rights and civil liberties, to me, are about democracy. They are really about democracy. Now, sometimes when we say democracy, people think it just means going to vote. To them, the entirety of democracy is showing up on a Tuesday in November, pulling the lever for one sorry politician or the other, and calling it a day. That is not what democracy is really about. Democracy is really an idea, and it is the idea that everyone matters, that everyone is included, that everyone has a voice, that everyone is part of the community, is part of something bigger than themselves, has a role to play in what our community looks like, and has the ability to hold those in power accountable. Democracy is not just about voting. It is about this idea that we are all tied up together, that we are all part of something, that we are all united, that we are all linked. We may have different ideas, we look different, we act different, we believe differently, but we are part of a community together. That is what democracy is really about. It's not about hierarchy. It's not about I'm better than you. It's not about I should be in power, my group should be in power, not yours. It's about the idea that we are in it together. And the only way, to me, that you can have a real, true, deep democracy is when you have real civil rights and real civil liberties. When you have these protections for who you are, both protected by the government and protected from the government at exactly the same time. That is what civil rights are in the abstract, right? In the American context, and what we are celebrating and thinking about today is the way that so often civil rights have been denied in this country, and so many ways democracy has been diminished over the entirety of our history. And we celebrate Brown because it was a great stride forward for racial justice and for making civil rights real, especially, but not exclusively, for African Americans. To ignore the fact that African Americans in particular in this country are the ones who have been denied civil rights, to ignore the fact that African Americans have been the ones excluded from democracy would just be an error of it would be a lie. Right? We can pretend, we can say, it's just about inclusion in general. We can try and avoid racial justice. To do so would be a lie. It would be factually false, and it would not get us anywhere closer to where we want to be if we really believe in democracy, if we really believe in civil rights. And so we should name it for what it is. That is not to say that there are not other groups that have been and continue to be excluded in American democracy and in American civil rights. Because one of the sad facts of our world is that people who like to exclude people usually like to exclude a lot of people, not just one group. They don't usually narrow it to just limiting and leaving out one particular person. In general, they like exclusion as a general practice. And that's something that we should fight back against too. So all of this brings me back to our friend Langston Hughes, who said, democracy will not come today, this year, not ever, through compromise and fear. And that, I think, is particularly relevant because we have to acknowledge that the only way that we extend civil rights, the only way that we extend racial justice, the only way that we extend democracy is through fearlessness. A lot of times we are afraid to talk about civil rights. We are afraid to talk about race. We are afraid to diagnose what ails the country and what ails ourselves. Instead, especially here in Kansas, where we like to play Kansas nice, we are afraid to say what is really going on. And we are fearful. We can be fearless. We can be polite still and be fearless at the same time in acknowledging what we need to do and the ways in which civil rights remain denied. And I think what this moment calls for, this particularly fraught, tense, friction-filled moment in our history, what it requires is a heavy dose of fearlessness. And so when I look around today and I say, what are civil rights today? What are the civil rights that we have to protect today to make sure that civil rights, civil liberties, and democracy all remain strong? I come up with two that I want to mention to you in particular. By no means are these all of the civil rights. By no means are these all of the challenges we face, but they are two pressing issues that I think if we address them, we will have done our part for fearlessness. We will have done our part for civil rights. We will have done our part for racial justice. The first one that I want to mention to you is voting rights. Voting rights, voting rights. I know I said just a few minutes ago that democracy is not just voting. That does not mean that it is not an important component of democracy at the same time. One of the ways that we show up and make our voices heard is through the vote. But the vote is more than just, again, casting a ballot. The right to vote is a marker of citizenship. It's a marker of who matters, of who counts, who is included, who is excluded, who is included, who is kicked out of the community. And so that is why, over the entire history of the country, we have seen so many battles over the right to vote, over who is included in the franchise and who is not. So if you go back to 1787, when the Constitution was ratified, 7% of the people who lived in the country were eligible to vote. 7% of the people who lived in the country were eligible to vote. Rich, white men. Not just men, not just white men, rich white men were the only folks who were eligible to vote. And over the ensuing 250 some odd years, we have fought a constant battle to expand the franchise, only to then see counterattacks that attempt to limit it. You know, the first thing that we did was expand the franchise to poor white men. And even that was conflicted. Even that was conflicted. As soon as they did that, as soon as they got rid of the property qualification that existed in the 1780s, you had to own a certain amount of property in order to be eligible to vote. They got rid of that so that poor white men could vote. Right away, what they did instead was impose a tax requirement instead. So you didn't have to own property to be eligible to vote, but you did have to pay taxes. Now, the clever thing about that is that at the time, there was no income tax. The income tax was still illegal. It was not yet constitutional. There was no income tax. There was not sales tax. The only tax that there was a property tax. So they got rid of the property requirement, put in a tax requirement instead, but it was really the same thing, right? The pushback in expanding the franchise. We fought a civil war over African-American citizenship and humanity that resulted, for a short period at least, in Black men in the South being enfranchised, only to again immediately have the pushback of Jim Crow. We expanded the franchise to women after a long, hard fight through a passage of a constitutional amendment. We had to pass a law in the 1920s to allow Native Americans to vote. We actually had to pass a law, the Dawes Act, to make Native Americans, the people who were here first, we had to pass a law to make them citizens in order to make them eligible to vote. Then, of course, we have the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which does away with de facto and de jure Jim Crow and allows African Americans in the South to vote for the first time in large numbers. And then we finally get a constitutional amendment that allows folks between 18 and 21 to vote. So it takes us 200 plus years, almost 225 years, but we go from 7% of the population being eligible in 1787 to roughly 75% of the population being eligible today. But the story does not end there, because even now, we continue to see this constant give and take, this constant friction, this constant conflict over who will be included and how. And so even though we largely agreed as a country that we think folks have the right to vote, that we want people to vote, that it's a good thing if people vote, for the last roughly 20 years, we have seen a real onslaught against voting rights all over this country. A few years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States struck down a key part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That bill that was born really of sweat and blood sacrifice by African-American civil rights workers in the South. John Lewis going over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Sweat and blood sacrifice, a lot of fearlessness. The Supreme Court struck down a key part of that bill just a few years ago. And immediately after, states all around the country started imposing new restrictions on the ability of folks to register, to turn out, and to have their vote count. 19 states have adopted additional restrictions on the right to vote in the time since. In some cases, they literally introduced the bill the very same day that the Supreme Court came down with its decision. The Supreme Court decision came down at 10 o'clock in the morning. The bill was filed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Every single one of those restrictions that we have seen introduced around the country has disproportionately harmed African Americans, young people, and senior citizens, without exception, every single one of them. And so what are civil rights today? That is what civil rights today is. Civil rights today is pushing back against the attempts to make it harder for people of color or anyone to register, to vote, to make their vote count. That is not about partisanship. To treat it as a political thing, to treat it as a partisan thing is really disgraceful. It diminishes it. To talk about the impact of those bills in partisan terms is a disgrace. It diminishes it. It diminishes what is really at stake, which is, again, the idea of who matters, of who counts, who is part of our community. That is something that goes beyond partisanship, something that goes beyond politics. That gets to the heart of who we are as a people and who we are as a nation. Beyond that, the tie here to civil rights is very clear in that it's about protecting people from discrimination. If that's what we take as our definition of civil rights, protecting people from discrimination. The reality is that there are several groups in this country who, regardless of their partisan affiliation, have always found themselves on the target side of restrictions on voting rights. You know, in the 1860s and 70s during Reconstruction, African Americans voted 90% plus for Republicans. Today, that is flipped the other way around. But there were restrictions on Black voting rights in 1870, and there are restrictions on Black voting rights in 2024. The partisanship changed, the restriction did not. That tells you it is not about partisanship, it is about something deeper. It is about protection from discrimination. It is about who matters, who is included, who is part of our community, who is not. So the only way that we deal with that is through fearlessness. As Langston Hughes told us, it is about being fearless and calling this out and saying that we will not accept it, that we want folks to be able to register, to participate, to have their vote count. That is something that we deal with here in Kansas in my work every day. Every year, the Kansas legislature introduces new bills to restrict voting rights. The last 2 years in a row, all of those have gone down to defeat on a bipartisan basis because people have acknowledged that this would restrict the franchise, would make it harder for folks to vote, and that is not who we want to be. But the fight continues and requires fearlessness. The other part of this, the other really important part around voting rights, is around rights restoration. So folks with convictions, folks with felony convictions, returning citizens. This is an issue here in Kansas and all over this country, where in many states, folks who have felony convictions are ineligible to vote, at least for a period of time after the conviction, and in some states, in perpetuity. So I used to be the executive director of the ACLU of Florida, which was Florida was the, I don't know what the opposite of gold standard is, right? But the worst on this particular issue, in that folks in Florida with a felony conviction were permanently disenfranchised. 1.4 million Floridians were permanently excluded from ever voting. It didn't matter how much they got their lives together, how much they paid the debt, how much they restored their role in community. Didn't matter how great they were doing. The state constitution said that doesn't matter. You are not part of this community. That's really what it says. You are not part of us. You are something separate. We don't care about you. 1.4 million. At one point, 1 in every 2 Black men in Florida was disenfranchised by this particular provision. And that is not, my friends, just a coincidence. It's not a unhappy circumstance, right? It was, in fact, the intent. And we know that because we can go back and look at the proceedings of the Florida legislature, and we can look at the debate they had when they produced this provision in the Constitution, You can probably guess when it was. It was immediately after the Civil War and the days after Reconstruction. And they said out loud, no hiding it, no subtlety, no little euphemisms. They said on the floor of the state legislature that they were introducing this provision to stop Black men from voting moving forward. That they would criminalize Black men, regardless of whether folks really engaged in behavior that we would consider criminal or not. They would criminalize Black men, and then they would remove their ability to vote and therefore strip political power away from them and show who is protected by the government and who is not, who has civil rights and who does not. That was in the 1870s, but the provision lived on forevermore, right? A few years ago, the voters of Florida passed a constitutional amendment to get rid of that provision. It has been a long and winding road. So the state legislature then made things to undermine the state voters' amendment. Some folks are now able to vote who were not able to do so before, but the overwhelming majority are not. Florida is its own special place. We can acknowledge that. It is its own special place. And yet, this particular pattern is one that we see all over the country. Most of the states of the country have at least some exclusion for folks who are returning citizens, excluding them from participating in the democratic process at some point. Here in Kansas, the law is not as bad as it is in some other states. Here, as soon as you are off probation or parole, once you've completed your sentence, you're eligible to vote. But a lot of people don't know that. A lot of folks don't know that. I can't tell you how many returning citizens I talk to who are just unaware that that is the law. Instead, they've heard about places like Florida. They've heard about places in the South, think that the law there is the law here, and so they withdraw themselves from the process. There are tens of thousands of Kansans who are eligible and don't know it. Tens of thousands. We did a little project at the ACLU of Kansas. There will be more data coming out soon, but you get a little sneak peek here. So the total population of the state of Kansas is about 3 million people. Right, there are about 115,000 people with felony convictions who are eligible to vote and not registered. 115,000 people in a population of 3 million. First of all, just think about how mind-boggling that number is, right? 115,000 people out of 3 million, not just excluded from the vote, right? But that means 115,000 people have, over the last 30 some odd years, made their way through our criminal justice system. Think about how expansive, how disastrous it is to have a criminal justice system that has touched 115,000 people out of 3 million in the state of Kansas. Those are really mind-boggling numbers. But in the context of voting rights, in the context of civil rights, 115,000 people is a whole lot of people who we've said are not included in the community, are not protected from discrimination. In fact, discriminating against them actively by saying that they are not eligible to vote at some point. You know, there are a few states where you can vote from prison with felony conviction. You vote from prison in Vermont and Maine, and they have very high voter turnout in a prison, I'm told. People enjoy engaging with the community there. The other important note here, right, is that, again, even in a place like Kansas, which is not among the most diverse of the American states, there is a huge racial imbalance here. So of the roughly 115,000 people who are eligible but have felony convictions and don't know it, that makes up about 2%. The people on the list are about 2% of the state's white population. About 2% of the white people who live in Kansas are in this bucket. 14% of the Black population in Kansas is in this category. That's telling, and not in a good way. Right? That tells you something about our system. It tells you about the structure. It tells you about civil rights. It tells you who is protected from discrimination and who is not. It tells you about the system that we have and why we get the outcomes that we do. Because if folks are excluded from the democratic process, if their voice is not being heard, if they are not even at the table, well, by golly, you can be sure that their perspectives are not included when it comes time to talk about policy, when it comes time to talk about what we're going to do. If you leave 115,000 people out, you are going to have a different discussion than you will have if you invite them to the table. And that is precisely the reason that we have left them out. Because there are some folks who don't want those perspectives included. And to pretend that that does not go back to racial justice and civil rights and our democracy would be folly. So we have to do something about that. We have to be fearless in pushing back against this narrative. We have to be fearless in saying that we want folks to be included in our community. We have to be fearless in saying that we don't want to continue to discriminate against folks. We have to be fearless in saying that when a debt is paid, it is paid, and folks should be able to rejoin the community as full citizens, as our brothers, our sisters, our neighbors, our family, as members of our community. We have to push back against that narrative and be fearless in doing so because democracy and civil rights depend on it. So that's the issue of voting rights, The second one that I want to mention to you is closely tied to where we just came from, what we just talked about, and that is the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is absolutely a question of civil rights. You can believe anything you want about the system. You can believe anything you want about punishment and rehabilitation. You can believe anything you want about what we should do. The reality, though, is that the system that we have is one that is discriminatory. The one that we have is built on an architecture of white supremacy. And to dispute that is just to dispute the fundamental facts. The fundamental fact is that in a state like Kansas, again, not the most diverse place on God's green earth, the state's population is about 6% African American. 6% African American. Today, this morning, I check every morning, I check the prison numbers in Kansas. They put it on their Department of Corrections website. I look at it every morning to remind me of why we do the work we do. This morning, there are a little over 9,000 people sitting in Kansas prisons, and 35% of them are African American. In a state that is 6% Black, 35% of the people in prison are Black. When you include Latinos and Native Americans, the prison population in Kansas is more than 50% made up of people of color in a state that is less than 20% people of color. And you have heard about the disparities in the nation at large, which are bad, but actually the disparities in Kansas are twice as bad in those of the nation at large. Nationwide, the Black population is about 12%. The prison population nationwide is about 35% Black, right? So in Kansas, it's 6 and 35. Nationwide, it's 12 and 35. You don't have to be a math whiz to figure out that means that we in this state are doing twice as bad as the nation at large. You know, it's not about just who commits crime either, right? That's the thing that folks often mention as a way of saying that perhaps the system is not so bad as I make it out to be. The reality, again, nationwide, African Americans are 12% of the population. 11% of the drug users, so African Americans use drugs at a lower rate than white people do, and yet are more than 50% of the people serving time in prison for drug crimes. The only way you get to disparities that way is if something is going on. Now, we can disagree about what caused it. We can disagree about what to do about it. But I would hope that as Americans who are invested in the idea of civil rights and democracy, we can look at disparities that large and say something is happening here and it ain't good. Something is happening. We need to figure out what is going on. Instead, folks are often fearful and just want to back away from the conversation entirely. It involves questions of guilt. It involves questions of criminality. It involves questions of violence. It involves questions of race. And those are things that can be scary for folks. It can be scary to deal with. There can be a lot of fear-mongering about what we do. But it requires us to be fearless in acknowledging that something is happening here and we got to figure out what it is. Because the only way that you get to disparities that large, the only way you get to disparate treatment that significant is if something is going wrong at every step of the process. So African Americans are policed more, charged more harshly, more likely to be convicted, more likely to be sentenced harshly. At every step of the process, the disparity grows and grows and grows. So it is not the case that we just isolate one part of the system and say, oh, if we fix that, everything will be just fine. It's their fault. No, it is not anybody's fault. It is our fault collectively. We created this broken system, and it's going to take all of us, every last one of us, to construct a system that is fair and that promotes public safety. To believe that there is a trade-off between fairness, between civil rights, between justice, and public safety is a false choice, an absolutely false choice. We can absolutely protect public safety. We can absolutely punish wrongdoing. We can absolutely rehabilitate folks so that they are able to come back to community and protect people from discrimination, protect civil rights, protect democracy at the exact same time. That is what we have to do. That is what we have to do. Democracy depends on it. Civil rights depend on it. Those are the two issues that I would highlight for you this morning as the two most pressing ones on civil rights. That is not to say that there are not others. We can spend time talking about education, about fair housing, about banking, about lending, about employment, about income, about poverty. We can talk about all of those things, and the same patterns will repeat themselves in each one of those dimensions. And that is, again, because the way that we advance civil rights, the way that we advance racial justice in particular, is not by pretending it is some abstract, contextless thing just out in the ether. You don't advance racial justice, you don't protect civil rights by saying, I will protect civil rights. Instead, you do it by taking concrete action on each of these specific dimensions where it shows up. Civil rights, racial justice is not something that is just a phrase that is out in the world. It shows up in concrete ways. And that means that we have to identify it in each of the specific contexts and do something about it in that context. And all of that, of course, takes us back to democracy as well. And that is the thing that binds all of these issues together, is this concept that we say that we believe in this country, and that I believe in to my very core. I believe in to my very core that democracy is about making sure that we are in this together, that we are part of something bigger than ourselves, that we are stronger when we work together, that we are stronger when we include every perspective, even the ones that I don't like. We are stronger when we take them into account, when we weigh them, when we grapple with them, and when we do something about them. That is what democracy is about, the idea that everyone has a piece of this American project. That shows up in voting rights, it shows up in criminal justice, it shows up in all of these other ways. And the way we do that, the way that we acknowledge it, is the way good old Langston Hughes told us. And that is by being fearless, by being uncompromising in our commitment to our values. We compromise on policy, we compromise on specifics, but we are uncompromising in our values. And so my message to you today is simply to fear not, to do what Langston Hughes told us, to fear not. And if we do that, we can protect civil rights. We can protect people from discrimination. If we fear not, we can create a real, true, deep, inclusive, soul-enriching, prosperity-bringing, joy-delivering democracy. So fear not, fear not, fear not. I think I'll stop there and see if we have questions.
Thank you so much. We are taking questions from the room. We are taking questions online. And also Clinton Library has people, they may have questions as well. I don't see any online. We do have questions in here though.
Thank you.
Tell me your name first, too,
I'm
please.
Jim Williams from Brown v. Board of Education. As you know, 2 years ago, the Supreme Court in the affirmative action cases basically attacked the Brown decision. And they've continued to do that. They've turned the idea that the Constitution is colorblind against the intent of Thurgood Marshall and those folks from 70 years ago. What does the ACLU think of, I know, what the Legal Defense Fund, is there any light between ACLU and Legal Defense Fund on that issue? And how do we fight that, that new interpretation of Brown?
So great question. Thank you very much. So no, there is no daylight between us and LDF really on anything. Those are our running buddies and our friends, so that there's no daylight between us. I would just say the Supreme Court not only disagreed with what Thurgood Marshall and the architects of Brown said, right, but what the architects of the Reconstruction Amendments said, right? Thaddeus Stevens, the others who brought us the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, were very clear that they were not interested in a colorblind constitution to the extent that it meant that you ignored history, that you ignored context, that you ignored what reality was. What they wanted was a constitution that gave everyone a fair shot at success and protected people from discrimination. There is no ambivalence in the historical record about that whatsoever. And to pretend that there is just silliness, right? I mean, it's striking to me that the folks who position themselves as originalists, who say that the only thing, these are members of the Supreme Court, who say that what matters is what they perceive to be the original intent of the person who wrote that particular provision of the Constitution. Not even necessarily what everyone who was around at the time meant, but the specific person who drafted that specific part of the Constitution, that is who we should listen to forevermore. To not do that in this particular case is sort of telling of the ideological commitment that is there, right? It is an ideological commitment rather than a methodological one. When these justices have told us for a long time that, oh no, I have no ideology. This is just the method that we do. This is the way of doing law. To do that around getting rid of affirmative action, to get rid of any sort of acknowledgement of challenges that communities of color or other folks who are disadvantaged historically have, is to ignore history. It is ahistorical in every respect. The Freedmen's Bureau, for example, was not a colorblind institution. It was the hallmark of the sort of Reconstruction efforts that folks were to pretend like it was a colorblind institution. It's crazy. It's crazy. And so I think that interpretation that they have is uniquely destructive, both because of the impact of the issue, although we should also be clear that they have been attacking affirmative action in particular since 1977 with Bakke, right? So all they really did was finally come out in the open and say what everyone knew to be the case for the last 30 years. What we do about it, though, is always the more challenging question, right? And here, I think the answer is that as much as we celebrate things like Brown, as much as we celebrate many of the important Supreme Court decisions of the 1950s and 1960s, we should recognize that they are historical anomalies. The idea that the Supreme Court of the United States is the guardian of civil rights, is the champion of protecting people from discrimination, of making sure that more people are included rather than excluded, is also ahistorical. Because the reality is that in the entire history of the country, going back to the 1780s until today, the period in which the Supreme Court was the guarantor of civil liberties and civil rights was basically 1954 to 1967. And to some degree, they have been coasting on that reputation ever since. They have been inoculated from criticism in many ways because of that glorious period, those glorious 2 decades. And that doesn't mean that the other decisions are wrong necessarily, although I happen to believe many of them are, right? What I do think, though, is that we should have a cold-hearted, level-headed assessment of the role that the Supreme Court plays and whether they are guarantors of liberty or whether they instead reinforce the status quo and reinforce hierarchies of exclusion. I think certainly over the last decade, the latter is more true than not. All of that means that yes, folks should continue to go to the Supreme Court. I work for the ACLU. We litigate a lot. We sue people, among other things. Well, we do other stuff too, right? But we sue people. Only people who deserve it, but we sue people. And we have been to the Supreme Court more than any other organization other than the federal government. We have appeared in more civil rights and civil liberties cases than any other organization other than the federal government. We will continue to do that. We will continue to have a strong legal program. But the idea that the Supreme Court, either of the United States, the Supreme Court of Kansas, the Supreme Court of Arkansas, the Supreme Court of any state, the idea that judges are going to save us is a mistake. It is a strategic mistake, and it is to misunderstand the role of the courts in our system. If we're going to save ourselves, we're going to save ourselves. That means that we have to do the work in communities through organizing. It means we have to do the work in policy and in legislatures. It means we have to do the work in every other venue too, not simply expect that because there was a precedent in 1954 that a court 70 years later is going to say yes, absolutely, and extend it. They are not. Courts are broadly accountable to the people, but not in any specific instance and not in any specific moment. It is over the broad course of history. And so what we have to do collectively is organize for civil rights, organize against discrimination, make that voice and that power known in local communities, in states, and in the nation at large. And eventually, the courts will catch up. But no one should rely on the Supreme Court to fix everything, because that ain't gonna happen.
All right. We have another question in here, and I also want to remind people who are watching us virtually that you can put questions into the chat, and we will ask them.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Velma Murphy. I'm from the Panhandle of Florida. We're a lot different. As you know, since you live in Florida, I was born and raised, and I live in the Panhandle of Florida, and we are a different creature. The conversation in Florida right now among us is that you talked about the prison system and parole and probation. We have the nominee or the prospective nominee of the Republican Party that has been convicted. And the conversation in our circles is that because in Florida, as you said, at this time, he can't vote. What are your plans?
Mm-hmm.
Or because I know you're talking nationwide, because the conversation is that we really believe that our governor will find a way for him to vote. And how would that affect? Because right now, the only way you can vote once you come off of probation and parole is that you have paid all your restitutions. And you know that's impossible for some people. Okay. Can you?
Absolutely. So, first of all, I don't know who you're talking about. Who could you possibly be talking about? Be more specific. So here is one of the challenges, right? Is that the law in Florida is very complicated, as it is in many places, right? The law is set up in a way to discourage people, to make it so complicated that they can't figure it out. You were talking about fees and fines, restitution, for example, right? So when I was in Florida and working on this issue, part of the challenge, people have no ding-dang idea how much they owe. The state government doesn't know. The county doesn't know. We went to one place, I remember, where the county had 6 different numbers for what one person owed. $0, $200, $2,000, $20,000. That's a big difference, right? It is set up to make it so complicated, so onerous, so challenging that people just give up and back away. I say that in this context because the law in Florida is that if the conviction is in another state, the law that applies in the other state is what carries over to Florida. So if, for example, the conviction were in Georgia, where the laws are more onerous, then there's no question that the individual we're talking about here would not be able to vote. However, the conviction is in New York State, where the laws are much more amenable and say that it doesn't necessarily exclude you from voting. If you're currently serving time, for example, then it may, but if you're not actually in prison, if you're out on probation or parole, then it may not, right? So a lot will depend on what the specific sentence that gets handed down in the 34 felony case is, right? But it's certainly possible that whatever the sentence is in New York is not one that would result in the conviction stopping the individual from voting in New York. And if that's the case, then it doesn't stop him from voting in Florida. That's important for him, right? But the more important lesson is for everyone else, right? Which is that it's so complicated. That means that it is different for every state. And that means that the default is that people assume that they're not eligible. They assume that they're not going to be able to do it, and they just don't do it, and it discourages people. That said, I absolutely agree with you. If it is the case that he winds up being incarcerated or there's probation or parole, something like that, Governor DeSantis has already said that he will reconvene a special session of the legislature to pass a bill for this one individual. It doesn't matter what you think about the individual in question. It doesn't matter what you think about the conviction. What that says, though, is that democracy is less important than the fate and the stakes of one person. And I think that is a really dangerous, tragic, and authoritarian statement to make, right? To say that you are willing to convene the entire legislature, pass a bill for one particular person to treat them differently than you treat everyone else in the community is the opposite of civil rights, right? Is the opposite of justice, and is the opposite of what true democracy is about. So we all got to watch for a little bit, see what happens.
My name is Clayton Bryce.
Morning.
I'm a graduate of Brown versus Kubic Board of Education. And part of my degrees is in criminal justice. Now, my opinion is we need to take the educational system, the criminal justice system, and tear it all down and rebuild it, because everything is out of proportion. And all the counseling I've done over 60 years, people up here listen to their parents, and we don't want to grow. How do we educate people about all these laws you're talking about? I ran a halfway house, the first halfway house in the state of Kansas called Bryce House. I didn't know anything about this law, about helping those clients get their rights. How can we get that to people?
Right. So first of all, thank you for the question. Thank you for what you have done. And the answer is we just do it one step at a time, just like this, right? That is the most effective way, is just to tell individual folks and make sure that they know and spread the word. So we're doing some work with on the question of rights restoration, right? We're doing some work with the governor's office to change some policies to make it a little easier. So it used to be the case, for example, that when folks left probation and parole, they have a meeting at the end with a probation or parole officer, and they give them a stack of paper, 3,000 pages, right? And buried on page 672, paragraph 8 in 3-point font, it said you are eligible to register again. We worked with the governor's office to change the policy to hold on to the tables for some radicalism, to give that its own piece of paper in the packet. So it says you're eligible to vote, to give them a voter registration form at the exit meeting, and to have the probation or parole officer verbally tell someone that they're eligible, right? That will help moving forward, because it's one thing if I tell somebody that they're eligible, it's something else entirely if the probation or parole officer says it, right? There's a higher level of belief that it is true and not going to get you in trouble if the probation and parole officer says it. So that's a little thing that we can do and have done with the governor's office. Things like that we should be doing in every state in the country. Most states it is not like that. So doing that. And then it's about educating people one-on-one, right? Like it's making sure that as you encounter folks in your life, you're talking about voting, as you're talking about elections, because I don't know if you've heard, but there's an election coming up in November. Just be aware in case you hadn't heard. As people are talking about that and it comes up naturally, there will be folks who will say, oh, I can't register, I can't participate, I have a felony conviction. And the most impactful thing we can do in that moment, in that very moment, is say, actually, that's not true. Right? And if we create that movement, one person to one person to one person, That is the single most effective thing that we can do to educate folks while we're doing all of the sort of public education camp, right? So we're doing a registration program. We're going to spend a lot of money on advertising and on contacting people directly. But the most effective message is always person to person with people you know in your own circles and your own communities who may think that they're excluded, to tell them that they're not. But it's a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work, and I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy and overnight. Until we change the underlying policy to say that you're never deregistered, we're going to have a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Question. And then we'll bring Clinton into the stream for their questions.
Hi, I'm Stephen Gabar. I'm the retired executive director for the Kansas Council on Developmental Disabilities, also on the state advisory board or committee. And my question is around the voting rights. Seems to be the flavor of the month of the legislative activities in the last few years around Kansas, especially. Do you think that's going to continue, or is that just a sign of the times, or what do you think the next great area will be that we'll be having to work on civil rights issues?
I think voting rights will always be the flavor of the day, flavor of the month, flavor of the year, flavor of the decade, flavor of the century. So I think we have seen these battles all the way back to the beginning, and so we're going to keep on seeing them. They will never go away because they really do get to the heart of the questions that people have, right? They go to the heart of sort of contests over power and who will lead. And so that is never going to go away. I think the specific sort of focus and emphasis in voting right, what is being attacked will change. So for example, 10 years ago now, here in Kansas, the focus on voting rights was around non-citizens voting, which was not a thing. It didn't exist. It didn't happen. It was a figment of the imagination, to be very, very clear. And yet the legislature and the Secretary of the State at that time here in Kansas spent a huge amount of time and energy and legislative activity on that issue. Many of the policies they implemented were ones that we challenged in court and got struck down as violations of the Constitution and the law. And others they simply stopped doing when it proved that they were ineffective and that there was no problem, right? But today, in the Kansas State Legislature and in legislatures around the country, there is not the same focus on non-citizens voting as there was a decade ago, right? Now it's about what they call election integrity or other efforts to make it harder for folks to participate, but not really non-citizens anymore. So in Kansas this year, the big thing was about trying to get rid of the grace period for mail-in ballots to be received at the election office. So we have a law that says if you postmark your ballot, your mail-in ballot on time, it can arrive up to 72 hours after the election because the mail is slow sometimes. Especially in rural Kansas, the mail is slow sometimes. There are parts of Kansas where the mail is literally sent to Nebraska and then back in order for it to be processed. And you do that, it takes some extra time. And so a few years ago, the legislature said, because of that, we should acknowledge and give people who've done everything else right, who've taken the time to request a mail-in ballot, who've taken the time to sit down at their kitchen table and do the research to figure out who they want to vote for, who fill in the bubbles, who fill in the bubbles within the bubble. They don't make X's. They don't go outside the lines. They color entirely inside it. They go and get a stamp. Those are expensive now too. They put it in the mail. They did everything right. We shouldn't exclude them just because it comes 24 hours after the election. The last 2 years, there have been big efforts to get rid of that grace period because the proponents say, well, if you count those ballots later, the vote totals will change from Tuesday to Thursday. Well, that's what happens when you count votes. The totals change. They will do that anyways, right? Just the total when you go to bed at 10 o'clock on Tuesday night is not the guaranteed total like from down on high, right? You continue to count votes. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff now. I think in a few years from now, that will change. It will be something else, right? The specific mechanism will be different, but the underlying thing will be the same, right? Because all of the election integrity sort of provisions that have been attacked the last couple of years, including this grace period, are ones that we know disproportionately disenfranchise African Americans and Latinos. There's no question about it. There's one on signature match, right? We know where if you send in a mail-in ballot, the signature on the ballot has to match the one that's on file at the registrar's office. You might have done that 30 years ago, right? My signature doesn't look the same today as it did yesterday, much less 30 years ago. And we know that African Americans in particular are 2 to 3 times more likely to have their signatures rejected as not matching as anyone else, right? So no matter what the mechanism is, the group that is made vulnerable by it has been the same throughout all time. I think that will continue. And I think voting rights will absolutely continue to be attacked, and we all have to remain vigilant because of it. I long for the day when that is not the case.
All right, we will bring Clinton into the stream and we'll hit their questions. And if we have a little time left, then I have a question.
Good morning. So we have 2 questions from here in Little Rock. I will read you the first one. It's kind of a statement and a question. Let's talk about private prisons and how private prisons need warm bodies, so they'll take what the police consider the least valuable. How can we then promote the mindset and philosophy of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Thank you for the question. So on the first one on private prisons, I believe that private prisons are an abomination. I believe that they are a moral disgrace that have no place in a civilized society. I think this is something that really unites people across ideological boundaries and across borders of difference. They absolutely exist for a profit motive, and I have a problem with profiting off of the suffering and immiseration of others. There's also no doubt that in securing the profit motive that you would expect of any for-profit private company, oftentimes what happens is people wind up getting treated very poorly. Healthcare is right. When it comes time to figure out how to reduce costs, what do? They cut healthcare for folks who are in the facility. They cut meals, they cut rations, all of those things. And that is both bad from a moral perspective, but also does nothing to help rehabilitate folks for when they come back to the community, right? If you mistreat folks while they are incarcerated, what you're really doing is hurting yourself in the long run, because the overwhelming majority, close to 90 to 95% of folks who are in prison come back to communities. They don't stay there forever. We don't throw them away and forget them, although some people would like to. Folks come back to communities. And the experience that they had in a carceral facility is going to help determine what kind of neighbor, what kind of community member, what kind of contributor to society they are. So if you do for-profit prisons that treat people poorly, that don't have community programming, that don't have things to prepare people to come back, you're going to get folks who are unprepared when they come back. And you're going to have weaker communities as a result. Even if it doesn't offend you morally the way it does, it disgusts me to think about. Even if it doesn't disgust you, think about the long-term impact of that. And there are a lot of folks, I think, across the spectrum who agree with that perspective, which is why a lot of states have banned private prisons and why the federal government is using them less than it did in the past. Not gotten rid of them, but is reducing their usage. Here in Kansas, we have no private prisons. And that is because we had a governor, a man named Sam Brownback, who I disagreed with quite often. But he was very clear that he found private prisons to be wrong. And so he refused to entertain them and have any in Kansas. There were a couple opportunities where they could have done that, chose not to. I would encourage states around the country to do the same thing. The second question about how can we embody Black Lives Matter, or what can we do about that? I think a couple things. First of all, we often think about Black Lives Matter in the context purely of policing. And I think there's no doubt that is where it originated in some ways, and making sure that we have policing practices that are respectful, that really do encourage civil rights, that are respectful of constitutional rights is important. But the more important sentiment there, right, is that it's not just that Black Lives Matter with police, right? There's not an imaginary written in invisible ink with police after the words Black Lives Matter. It really should be that we accept and implement the idea that Black Lives Matter every day in every context in all of these things. And that means acknowledging humanity. It means acknowledging citizenship. It means acknowledging democracy. That's what all of that is about. In the context of policing, there's a bunch of things we can do, right? There are libraries full of books on the things that we need to do to make our policing system one that is accountable, one that is transparent, one that is respectful, because it is a disgrace that police shootings in this country are exponentially higher than they are anywhere else in the world, and that African Americans in particular are the victims of police brutality and police shootings more than anyone else. So that really starts at the local level, though, right? Expecting the federal government to do that, I think, is a strategic error. Expecting even state governments to take those actions, I think, is a strategic error. I think the way that we will make sure that Black Lives Matter with police accountability is by taking action at the local level with city governments, with police departments, with county governments, and getting real policies that actually hold people accountable and impose standards that do not currently exist in most places. Thank you.
So we have two more questions if time will allow for it. Let me read you this question. Eric Higgins, an Arkansas sheriff, had a bold idea to transform incarceration here in Pulaski County at the regional detention facility. He conducted an experiment which has been featured on Netflix. The show is called Unlocked, a jail experiment. Instead of locking inmates up for 23 hours with 1 hour of recreation, he removed sheriffs from the inside in the pods and allowed them to be a community, opened the bars so they could move around freely, and allowed them to work together and form a democracy within their environment. This experiment proved successful and made the unit a better and more secure facility as a whole. So the questions from that are, 1, can this idea be extended to other prisons? And 2, can programs be created that focus on inmates being trained in trades like auto mechanic, welding, plumbing, and electrical work so that they can be successful upon reentry to the community, to help set them up for success and provide them with valuable needed skills to support themselves and their families?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Yes, it's a great example. I've heard a little bit about that program. I don't know a lot about it, but I've heard about it and heard that it was very successful. And I think the lessons from it absolutely are ones that are transferable and should be transferred. In most places around the country, jails are controlled by county sheriffs or by county governments, and so they have a great deal of discretion. They can do a lot of things without anyone telling them to do it, right? You don't have to pass a law at the state legislature. You don't have to pass a law at the federal government. Sheriffs can implement those sorts of programs on their own, and they absolutely should, because they absolutely do allow folks to be enabled in rehabilitation and to be better prepared to come back out and live a life in community with others in a successful way. So I think those lessons are absolutely transferable and should be implemented in jails around the country. Prisons are controlled by the state government, and there it is absolutely essential that Department of Corrections implement robust programming. It is really a hodgepodge both within states and across states. Which facility you wind up at oftentimes determines whether there is a program at all, much less the quality, much less how many spots there are. That should not be left to chance. That should not be that sort of arbitrary thing. Instead, we should really be prioritizing that within our departments of corrections. The lessons are very clear that not only do folks contribute better to community when they're prepared, when they have skills training, when they have GED programs, things like that, recidivism goes way down as well. Folks are much less likely to commit crimes in the future if you give them skills and training and prepare them to be able to survive when they're back from incarceration. We can look at examples like there in Pulaski County, around the country, and around the world. You know, I was in Germany a few months ago, and the German prison system is as different from the American system as the Earth is from Mars. It is like living on an entirely different planet. You go to the facilities and they look like an elementary school. Folks have programming, they have a room that they go to, they're held accountable, but it is not the punitive thing that you see in American facilities. Like everything about it is about rehabilitation, is about skills training, is about preparing folks, is about restoration rather than vindictive punishment, which is oftentimes the vibe that you get if you go to any sort of prison facility in the United States. There are better models available. We should use them.
Okay, our next question, let me read this to you. What you are suggesting is incredibly ambitious. The powers that be, those who actually change the system or can change the system to become what it needs to be, are less likely to do so without incentive to do so. So the question is, what do you propose would be the greatest motivation to convince those in authority to make the necessary decisions to improve the systems to benefit all citizens?
Yeah, so a great question. I am ambitious. I believe democracy requires boldness. And so I think unless you are audacious, you might as well just pack it in and go home. Go big or go home. So I think we absolutely have to own that too, right? While also recognizing that even as we want big, bold, audacious, ambitious change, it happens in increments. You have to be willing to settle for small pieces without ever losing sight of the big change that you want. And those two things cannot be enemies of one another. You can be frustrated or unsettled by the fact that it's a small change that happens now while you want the big change. But you can't let the two things run contrary to one another and dissuade you either way. That said, I think what we have to do is show the voice, the power of the civil rights movement and the civil liberties movement and movement for justice and equality. I think politicians respond to pressure, and pressure doesn't have to mean disruptive, although it can be, right? It doesn't have to mean yelling and screaming and calling people names, although sometimes that can be gratifying in the moment. What it means instead is a steady drumbeat that this is something we care about, this is something we expect to do. And when you have a democracy, you can hold people accountable for the choices that they make. We do have elections, we do have contests between people, and our charge is to tell people that this particular issue matters enough to me that I will cast my ballot based on who does it and who doesn't. Now, to only work in electoral politics is a mistake too, right? You got to use community organizing. You got to show up in other ways. You got to be changing the narrative. You got to engage in the legals, right? You got to do all of those things. But the thing that folks in power respond to more than anything is pressure, is making it so that they cannot continue with the status quo, making it so loud, so visible, so frickin' annoying that they finally say, oh, all right, we will do this thing just to get you to leave me alone. I think that especially works at the local level, and the way we build change at the national level is on the backs of lots of local changes. You show something at the local level that works, you get another place to do it, then another place, then the state, then the federal government follows. And those folks at the local level, you can absolutely be in conversation with them relatively easily. You can see them at the grocery store and complain about something, and they will stand there and listen. They absolutely will. I used to work in local government. I used to work for the city government. I used to work for a city council person. And folks would always come up and complain about the pothole in the street. They would complain about the tall weeds. They would complain about this and that. But what they wouldn't do when they saw their state legislator or their Congress, they wouldn't complain about bigger ticket issues, right? They would stay focused on the pothole, on the weeds. By all means, be in touch with your elected officials, and that's the way that we do it. I mean, it sounds almost glib. It sounds almost too easy. And that's because it actually is that easy if we just do it. And if we do it at scale. And that's the thing that stops us, is oftentimes we don't do it. We think, if I call and leave a message for them again, they're not going to do anything. Well, that one time they might not. But if you keep on doing it, if you keep on keeping on time in, time out, every single issue, every single time, then eventually it does build up and it does change. The way that we get change from folks in power is by persistence, right? Staying at it in a water on stone, water on stone, water on stone. And that's a frustrating and oftentimes dispiriting thing to do because you want the change to come faster. And you're like, why won't these people listen? Why won't they do what is so blindingly, obviously right? And the answer is you just got to keep at it because they will eventually respond so long as we live in a society with democratic institutions that give us the ability to do that, make use of it.
Is that your last question, Brian?
I got one more, Joy. So as you know, a room full of educators here and there, and this question, of course, comes from an educator. We in education have done a lot to protect the rights of persons with disabilities. How can these types of policies be expanded to all citizens, or rather, why can't they?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So many of the rights for folks with disabilities, especially in the educational context, are protected by federal legislation, by the IDEA Act in particular. And that was a long, hard-fought battle. Like many of the civil rights laws we have, we now sort of take it as just part of the architecture, right? It just sort of fades into the, like, we assume that it has always been thus, but it was not. Right? It was a long, hard battle, right? When you think about the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which applies in some other contexts and on some other thing, right? That didn't pass until the early 1990s, right? There are still institutions today that still have plans to come into compliance with ADA that was passed more than 30 years ago, even though it's been around, right? So first of all, I think we got to actually implement the protections that we have for folks with disabilities. Every school district I ever heard of or worked with has someone who has almost a full-time job of responding to issues that come up under IDEA. So we have to actually implement them, right? But the more important thing I want to say here is that if you want to have those level of protections for other folks, if you want to make sure that other groups of individuals based on some particular characteristic are protected in the same way, the only way to do that is through legislation. You're not going to get a court to hand down a decision that characteristics should be protected in that way. I mean, for that matter, folks challenge the constitutionality of IDEA and ADA. So you're not going to get a court to do it. What you have to do is build pressure at the local level to create those policies first in local school districts or in local cities and counties, and then in the state, and then in the federal government. A number of places have non-discrimination ordinances, for example, that cover groups that are not covered by existing non-discrimination law. There are a number of places, for example, where LGBT status is not protected in any way from discrimination by state law. And so cities, counties, school districts adopt non-discrimination ordinances to add that category to make sure folks are protected. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. It is absolutely just a matter of what you're going to do, how you're going to persist at it, and who you're going to get to be on your side to do it. Those are long, hard roads, though, right? They require a lot of persistence, and they require a lot of optimism, too, because invariably, when you introduce a provision that someone should be protected, there will be someone who says, oh, you're trying to give them special rights. Without that, there's never been a single time where someone has said that any group should be protected from discrimination, where the counterpoint was, oh, you want to give them special rights. So you got to be prepared for that, be prepared to respond to why that is not the case, be prepared to respond about the virtues of non-discrimination for whatever category of person you're talking about if you're going to succeed.
That it, Brian?
Y'all got a lot of questions in Little Rock. Y'all a very inquisitive bunch.
All right, I think they're finished in Little Rock. I don't see any online. If you will bear with me, I just have one more question, my question. So before I became a museum professional, I used to work in juvenile justice in Florida. One of the things that I noticed was that the civil rights of kids aren't as protected as the civil rights of adults. For example, say a simple possession charge. In adult court, that would be at max 6 months of probation. In juvenile court, that might get you 24 months of probation, which I thought was odd. But also, I remember maybe 5 years ago, I think the ACLU in Florida put out a report that in students, it was about the school to prison pipeline, and students of color tended to get punished more harshly than non-students of color. And also you would get punished for things that non-students of color would not be punished for. And so my question is, what is being done to protect the civil rights of kids? Because some of these kids are getting their civil rights taken from them before they even become adults, even losing the right to vote before they even become adults to vote.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You're absolutely right. So despite the fact that we say that we believe that young people are in fact young people and are not fully formed or not fully fashioned, and so sometimes make poor decisions, we oftentimes treat them in the system as though they are the most mature, most wise, most worldly person who ever did live. And we trick ourselves, right? We delude ourselves into believing that, it's for their own good. This is the way they'll learn, without taking cognition of any sort of actual data or evidence we have, which is that those sorts of super punitive responses do enormous long-term damage to young people. They damage them psychologically, they damage them socially and sociologically, they do damage to the families that they in. Right? It's not just the individual, it's the whole family and network of support that suffers in those cases, right? So it is a huge problem around the country. In Florida, one of the other things about that report we also found was that young men of color, young Black men in particular, were also much more likely to have their cases moved to adult court for the most severe offenses. That way, they're punished even more harshly, right? Not so much for the drug possession, but for anything that is a more severe crime, much more likely than a white male who committed the same crime to be moved into adult court, which has its own set of problems. So I think this really does vary by state. So I will say, I will take a moment to applaud the state of Kansas, because a few years ago we did adopt a pretty significant reform of our juvenile justice system here that significantly decreased the number of charges and the likelihood that a young person would wind up incarcerated. It made it much more likely that folks were engaged in sort of a community-based system for the juvenile justice. And so our numbers in our juvenile justice facilities are down something like 80 or 90% as a result. And it is a much better model. It ain't perfect though, right? So in particular in Kansas, as in many states, one of the big issues we continue to have is fees and fines, right? This is something that's come up in a couple of different contexts now this morning, right? So fees and fines, they are the bane of our existence in so many ways, right? Fees and fines, young people getting charged enormous fees and fines when they go through this juvenile justice system. It's just silly on its face. I have a teenager, he ain't never paid a bill in his life. The idea that the young person is gonna pay the fee and fine just makes no sense at all. And the reality is that if anybody pays, it's gonna be the family, but most often, the families themselves are struggling, and a lot of times the offense that the young person committed was something related to the economic insecurity of the family, right? So it becomes this sort of cycle that no one ever breaks out of, right? The state of Kansas, the various counties levied hundreds of thousands of dollars of fees and fines last year. In Sedgwick County, where Wichita is, I think the number was about $290,000 in fees and fines assessed. They collected exactly 5,000 of that, right? Nobody's pay, and not because they don't want to pay, right? It's not disrespect, it's not refusal. They don't pay because they can't pay. People want to be done with the business, right? They want to handle their business to be able to move on with their lives. So when people don't pay, it's largely because they can't. The biggest problem here in Kansas is that these fees and fines, they go with you into adulthood, It's not like they terminate when you turn 18. We don't say, oh, it's a clean wash, go forth and prosper, young one. No, the debt stays with you. So I know of an example of a young guy from Wichita who had been in the juvenile justice system, had been incarcerated. Then he got out and was the model of what you would want to see, the model of rehabilitation. He got a job. He moved to Ohio. He got a good paying job in a manufacturing plant there, had a family, had kids. He was in his mid-20s. He was paying on a payment plan to get rid of this 5-figure debt that he had. But the debt collector that the county had hired for its juvenile justice debt decided that the debt wasn't being paid fast enough. So they sent a bounty hunter to Ohio that stood outside the gates of the manufacturing plant where he worked and abducted him when he got off his shift one afternoon, put him on a plane, sent him back to Kansas, no warning to his family or anything, and put him in jail. That's messed up. That's messed up. I don't care who you are. That's a system that is messed up. It is not doing anything to help young people. It is not doing anything to help public safety, and is not something that a civilized nation should say it supports. All right, so we got a lot of work to do on juvenile justice. It is also, again, of course, the case there, young Black men in particular are much more likely to be assessed fees and fines and to be assessed higher amounts of fees and fines compared to everyone else for comparable offenses. Messed up. Say what? By another name, right? By another name.
All right. I think that is it. And we are over time anyway, but I thank you for
Thank you
continuing
very
to answer
much.
those questions. Thank you, Dr. Kubic. It is lunchtime, so we will be taking a break. We will end this stream. Our next presentation is at noon. Mr. Jeffrey Jackson from Washburn University. So please join us. Please start logging in about 11:55 so we can start right on time. And we'll be back.